When the sun rose on the plantations, the enslaved persons of America woke on dirt floors with only hard labor till sunset ahead of them. One figure lauded over them, watching their every move, the overseer. A haunting figure that could be cold, indifferent professional, or a loose cannon of cruelty and wanton violence. For slaves in the antebellum, the hostile and unpredictable was every day. Any slave could be favored by the master, set against the rest to watch over them as driver leaving any and all trust a broken dream. In a cruel and costly turn of fate, just as the European Western world turned its back on the slave trade, America would double down. When the shores of Africa were outlawed as a slave market, America protected its slave stock by creating its own internal market by breeding slaves. What lay ahead for the enslaved people of America holds shame history can barely look at: stolen autonomy, bodies, children, youths, and futures. It's Easy History Bro channel, and today we examine what slave breeding was like. The breeding farms of slavery were arguably its very darkest chapter. As the world around America awoke to the inhumanity of slavery, it should be stated as much for economic reasons as humanitarian ones. The United States found itself in no position to change course. Its population of around 1.5 million slaves at the turn of 1820 was the very economic backbone the country was dependent on. Tobacco, cotton, rice, and sugar were exports building the United States, all acquired through slave labor. So, with the slave trade being an international anathema, yet the country's most invaluable asset, the plantation owners of the United States found another way. They began breeding their own slaves. An internal slave market assured the antebellum economy would keep its strength. The roughly 1.5 million enslaved population of America would grow to around 4 million in just 4 decades. The largest breeding farms were in Maryland and Richmond, Virginia. These, among others, were to ensure the slave stock throughout the Deep South. There were legal ramifications that brought about the internal breeding of slaves in the United States. William Wilberforce, among other Christian groups, led an abolitionist charge to the British Parliament. In 1807, the Atlantic slave trade was all but finished with the passage of the Slave Trade Act in the British Parliament. Right at this time, the United States was in the midst of an agrarian expansion, the likes of which had never been seen before. Cotton gin brought the production of cotton into another league. The country was ever expanding its territory west, and sugarcane and rice production showed no signs of slowing. The U.S. would respond to the international outcry and calls to rid themselves of slave trade engagement. Coming into effect on the 1st of January 1808, the U.S. passed a law to prohibit the importation of slaves. Much like their British cousins, they would no longer be plundering persons from Africa to enslave them in the West. The United States had its own plan to protect its own produce, and so the grim business of natural increase began. Life on a plantation in the United States was a dignity and humanity-stripping experience for any enslaved person. This being said, the experience could vary depending on a variety of different factors. A slave on a plantation meant working fields from sunrise till sunset for 6 days out of 7. Food was far from a given. The quality of sustenance could be so low it would barely be suitable for an animal. Yet, it should also be stated, if an enslaved person was working for a smaller farm that was hardly getting by, they may not have got fed at all. Slaves of the plantations had just a meager shack for a living space. It would be rare to find more than a dirt floor, and there would likely be no furniture. Violence was only a moment away for many on plantations, and this was predominantly through the hands of the overseer. The slave and master dynamic was kept intact through the use of overseers and drivers. An overseer was usually employed on larger plantations and is the basis of many horror stories from the antebellum. The role of the overseer was to get the most possible work from the slaves working the fields. In fact, this was the very thing they would be paid for. Further deepening the hallways of cruelty, overseers would resort to nearly any means they viewed necessary to keep up the work rates of slaves. So birthed the reputation of cruel and nasty overseers, often drunkards, and prone to horrendously violent outbursts on their labor force. While this is true across innumerable accounts, the reality is a little muddier. The overseer was an impossible task with impossible demands, a middleman of a toxic operation. The master landowner would want maximum efficiency to consistently keep up profits, all the while keeping a contented workforce. One can only ask how. How could a band of slaves forced into hard labor and barely given enough food to keep them alive ever be a contented workforce? How could they ever find a desire to work harder while having autonomy and identity denied? The overseers themselves would vary in quality, professionally and personally. There would be sons of plantation owners looking to grasp the management of a plantation before acquiring their own. Also, there would have been semi-professional managers with similar aspirations, likely the most prominent demographic of overseers. Then, there would have been drunk, poor, lost individuals gleaning an opportunity for cruelty and violence. No matter who was overseer, they were rare to last at their post for more than a handful of years. Ironically, in an operation that stripped people of their humanity, there was a threshold for cruelty. The master saw his slaves as valued property. Any overseer deemed too vicious with his laborers was sent packing by his employer. Drivers were a role that epitomized the self-fulfilling morbidity of slavery. A driver was an individual given the same responsibilities as an overseer, but the person in question would be a slave. Yes, this is true. On plantations in the U.S. antebellum, masters were prone to appointing a slave from their plantation and giving them authority over fellow slaves. The dynamic of master and slave was given another horrendous layer in the use of a driver. In one ear, a driver could have a master telling him better privileges could come their way for better work from the slaves. However, a favored slave in the view of fellow slaves would not exactly bring an outpouring of trust. The responsibilities of a driver were hard to imagine and no doubt a task for the most skilled. How exactly a driver managed to keep the respect of fellow slaves and stay on good terms with the master is mind-bending. It's been written that drivers were usually hated by fellow slaves. Concurrently, records state that drivers were a more popular and longer-lasting figure than the overseer. Despite the near impossibility of the task, drivers held positions for decades and managed plantations much better than any overseer. None of this is to deny or dismiss. A driver was more than likely still very much hated by his fellow slaves. Yet masters would prefer the competence of a driver to the mixed bag of overseers, and slaves came to trust one of their own could lessen the cruelty of their circumstances. There are clear accounts within slave narratives that outline the cruelty and very real circumstance of people being forced into mating. Ever present in slave narratives from the U.S. antebellum period are instances of assault, rape, and forced relations. Much of this was done by slave masters, their sons, and also overseers in different instances. Yet there was clearly an increase in arranged marriages and forced mating committed in the name of increasing the slave stock. Edward Franklin Fraser would write in his famed works that slaves were treated the same as livestock, and that included mating. Other slave accounts, like that of Maggie Stenhouse, spoke of stockmen during slavery. These were enslaved men, weighed and tested, mirroring the processes used for livestock mating, before being put in a room with women the plantation owner wanted children from. Once the plantation owners had begun to view their human stock medically, men were selected to be bucks, and this left women as breeders. The role of a breeder was nothing more than taking the rights of enslaved women's bodies away from them. A system that would force sex upon them and give them no right to refuse, all to produce more slaves for the future. The conditions of this were horrifying. Enslaved women were carefully chosen for their breeding period. Childbirth for these young women practically began in their own childhood. Accounts would detail a 22-year-old woman who'd birthed 7 children, or a 19-year-old woman with 4 children. Their livelihoods were reduced to little more than being raped, enduring a pregnancy in poverty, and giving birth in a field before being expected to be pregnant once again within 2-3 months. Robbed of their bodies, robbed of their children, robbed of their lives, the breeding women of the antebellum faced indignities our history books hardly dare go near. To know more about breeding farms of slaves, watch another video. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Thank you, bro.